Kirsty, I was very interested in what you said there about these regulations being made under the Public Health Act, that they're not really there for public order. And that sort of links into my question. I want to ask about the impact of these regulations, the restrictions on people's right to peaceful protest and people's right to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Do you think these restrictions have been reasonable? And do you think the law, insofar as it impacts on our rights under Article 10 and Article 11 of the ECHR, has been accessible and foreseeable, having regard to the frequent changes in the law and the sometimes conflicting messages coming from the police and government? And thinking back to the Black Lives Matter protests last summer.
I think, firstly, there has taking your last part of your question first. The laws have been completely inaccessible and opaque, and we've seen that not only through the statistics, probably from the CPS, of so many wrongful prosecutions where nobody's suggesting that these are deliberate and malicious. People are just confused, and that goes all the way to those who are sitting in positions as being district judges, and similarly with the fixed penalty notices. So the law is being wrongly applied, which shows that it's not accessible. The regulations now are probably around 130 pages long. They are not even linked specifically quite often to the guidance. Even the lawyers get confused going through them. And so and when you look at laws that are inaccessible, what that means is that they themselves might be unlawful, because in order for a law to be lawful, it has to be clear and accessible so that people will understand if they have committed an offence. And I think that's the territory we're in now. The amendments have been so often and in such a confusing way, with guidance being mixed with amendments to the law, that people no longer know where they stand, and perhaps some, frankly, have given up on trying to abide in some way. In relation specifically to protests, another confusion here, of course, was that we were seeing, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests, and people were confused there because the regulations were entirely silent about protest. And so it seemed very confusing that there was restrictions on who could meet with who outside, and yet there was thousands of people gathering in this way. And then there was a specific exemption brought into the regulations to protect rights to protest. There was exemptions around restrictions on right to protest, and then that was removed. So we're in a position where it's now silent again. None of that is satisfactory, and restrictions on protest are potentially will have a chilling effect. And particularly with the pandemic, there was a lot of frustration, a lot of upset, and a lot of anguish, and people need to be able to express that. It obviously needs to be done in a way where people are safe, and this comes back to the need to focus on guidance, to focus on public health advice, which is what the guidelines are, and just split them apart from having any connection with criminal law, which is where they have been placed. If they were just headed, these are the public health guidelines and we are recommending you follow them, and then a separate section, here is the law, if you do this, these are potential consequences, then that would assist. Obviously Article 10 and Article 11 are qualified rights, and you're weighing up there, as Ms. Harman has pointed out, you're weighing up there in terms of the absolute right on protecting of life. But there's absolutely no reason why protests cannot take place with sufficient safeguards around them. And in fact, when you look at what the regulations allow, they now allow unlimited numbers within church services, for example, certainly under the Tier 4. And so there's also a lot of illogicality around where the red lines are drawn and where there's elasticity over what people can do. And I think that's what's led to a lot of the frustration, that people don't see the logical connection with the public health in a lot of occasions. But it's very important that we obviously protect our rights to free speech and protest and gatherings.
So I'm mindful of the time, so I'll try and do it as briefly as possible. Kirsty's touched on the deterrent effect that inconsistency and lack of clarity in the rules might deter people from getting involved in protests, and certainly anecdotally there's a great deal of evidence there. The other side of it, of course, is that, I mean, firstly, protest has never been banned. When it's been silent, protest is still, of course, allowed as common law right, enhanced, as it were, by the Human Rights Act, and the police have a duty to facilitate protest in these circumstances, regardless of what the regulations say. The issue that sort of has become very problematic is how restrictions are enforced, what restrictions are decided, and how the police go about doing that. We've talked about the 4 E's, the engage, explain, encourage, enforce. Well, there's a fundamental flaw there if officers don't actually understand what the regulations are. Who are you engaging with? Why? What are you explaining? What are you encouraging them to do? And ultimately, of course, when you're taking enforcement action, are you actually sure, or do you have a reasonable belief that somebody is acting contrary to the guidance? With the way with the regulations, there's the obvious slip: the guidance, the regulations. That has been a major issue, and some forces have treated protest as being banned, except during that time when protest was specifically exempt, and forces have also just got it wrong in general. And not to talk about sort of our own cases, but a case I had in August, prior to the new regulations in September, indicated that the Met Police had not really understood the regulations at all over the summer of the protests, when they threatened to arrest a client of mine who was seeking to organise a protest because they said he wasn't exempt, when actually he quite clearly was, which they eventually accepted. And not to talk about sort of our own cases, but a case I had in August, prior to the new regulations in September, indicated that the Met Police had not really understood the regulations at all over the summer of the protests, when they threatened to arrest a client of mine who was seeking to organise a protest because they said he wasn't exempt, when actually he quite clearly was, which they eventually accepted after pre-litigation. So, without an understanding of what the regulations are, the police shouldn't be trying to enforce restrictions on protests. Protests that are, adhere to the guidance at least of, hands, face, space, as it were, should not have interference at all. And the police should be, because it's been, their duty to facilitate forever, as it were, and it's certainly been in the manuals for the last decade plus, that duty to facilitate, should be adept at facilitating that protest and focusing on public order, because they're not experts in public health. And unless there's an obvious breach of it, they shouldn't be getting involved. But that inconsistency across the country, different forces, has certainly been a problem. And I think that's why you've seen different approaches at different times. If we're going forward, we have this, there needs to be greater clarity about it, but there also needs to be an understanding from the police that their duty is to facilitate. Sorry.